In 1943, it was, on paper, the most feared armored vehicle in the world. Its armor was thicker than anything that could reliably stop it at range. Its gun could destroy an opponent before that opponent could close to its own effective distance. One of these machines, handled well, could account for many times its number. And yet, across its whole service, more of these tanks were lost to their own mechanical failures than to any single cause on the battlefield. They broke down on the way to the fight. They sank into mud, they were too heavy to cross. They froze solid overnight and could not move by morning. They were abandoned by their own crews, undamaged by any shot, simply because they had stopped working and could not be recovered. This is the Tiger, the tank that was too good, and the strange truth about it is that almost everything that made it formidable was also what made it fragile. How a machine can be superior in every measure that shows on a specification sheet and still fail its crews, and what that says about the difference between a good design and a good fighting machine, is the subject of this. We will take the era as it was, the German heavy tank of 1943, and every figure here is drawn from the historical and engineering record. Start with the assumption almost everyone carries, because it is the one the Tiger's reputation is built on, and it is only half the story. The picture we inherit is of an unstoppable machine, a predator, and in a narrow sense that picture is earned. In a straight contest of armor against armor at distance, the Tiger was, for a period, close to untouchable from the front, and its gun was genuinely superior. But a tank is not a specification. It is a machine that has to arrive at a place under its own power, in working order, having crossed the ground between where it started and where it is needed, and then it has to keep running and be repairable when it does not, and be built in enough numbers to matter. And by every one of those measures, the qualities that made the Tiger fearsome on paper worked against it. The thickness of its armor made it heavy. The heaviness strained everything that had to move it. The sophistication of its running gear made the ride smooth and the gun accurate and the whole thing a nightmare to maintain. The care of its design made it slow and costly to build, so there were never enough. The Tiger is the clearest case in armored history of a machine optimized for the wrong thing, optimized to win the moment of contact, at the expense of everything required to reach that moment and repeat it. It is a design that answers the question, which tank wins a duel, superbly, and the question, which tank wins a war, hardly at all. And those turned out to be very different questions. There are 4 things worth understanding to see how that happened. What the weight actually did to the machine underneath the armor. Why the clever running gear was both its finest feature and its worst liability. Why fixing one was so much harder than fixing its opponents. And why there were never enough of them to matter, which was a design decision as much as an industrial one. 4 systems of failure, and behind all of them, a crew doing everything right in a machine that asked too much of them. If this is the kind of thing you would give an hour to, the channel exists for exactly this, so consider subscribing before we climb in. We start with the weight. Understand the weight, because everything else follows from it. The Tiger weighed in the region of 57 tons, which for its era was enormous, far heavier than the medium tanks it fought alongside and against. And weight in a tank is not a free quantity you add to buy protection. Every ton has to be carried by the suspension, driven by the engine, turned by the transmission, and supported by the ground underneath. The armor that made the Tiger nearly impervious from the front was the direct cause of a weight that pushed every mechanical system in the vehicle toward its limit and often past it. The engine, a large Maybach petrol unit, was powerful, but it was moving 57 tons, and to do that it ran hard, drank fuel at a tremendous rate, and left very little margin. The transmission and the steering gear, which had to take that engine's power and turn it into controlled movement of an enormous mass, were among the most stressed components in the machine, and they were the ones that failed most. A tank that weighs this much does not accelerate away from a problem or climb out of trouble on spare power, because there is no spare power. It is always working near its limits simply to move, and the ground itself becomes an enemy. A machine this heavy sinks into soft ground that a lighter vehicle would cross, and in the mud of the Eastern Front and the soft fields of Normandy, that meant a Tiger could become trapped by terrain alone, immobilized without a shot fired, its weight now not protection but a sentence. The operational range tells the story plainly. On a road, in good conditions, a Tiger might travel around 120 kilometers before refueling. Across country, working hard through bad ground, that fell to something closer to 70. These are not the numbers of a machine that ranges freely. They are the numbers of a machine that has to be delivered close to where it will fight because it cannot travel far on its own. And the fuel itself was a strategic problem, not just a mechanical one. A tank that drinks petrol at that rate is a tank chained to its supply of it, and Germany's fuel supply grew tighter as the war went on. So the very appetite of the engine that moved all that armor became another way the machine could be stopped without an opponent doing anything at all. A Tiger with an empty tank is as immobile as one with a broken transmission, and a heavy tank that empties its tank fast is a heavy demand on a supply line that was already struggling. The thirst was designed in the unavoidable cost of moving 57 tons, and it meant the tank consumed a share of scarce fuel out of all proportion to the number of them that existed, and that is the first inversion. The armor that was its glory was also an anchor, and the tank spent much of its life fighting not an opponent, but its own mass. Now think about why that weight sat where it did. It was not carelessness. It was a deliberate choice to prioritize protection and firepower above all else. To win the direct engagement, and every consequence that followed, the strain, the fuel, the sinking, the breakdowns, was the bill for that single-minded choice. So here's the piece that captures the whole paradox, and it lives in the wheels. To carry 57 tons and still give a smooth, stable ride, which matters enormously because a smooth ride lets a tank shoot accurately, the Tiger used a suspension system of overlapping and interleaved road wheels, a design the Germans called Schachtellaufwerk. Instead of a simple row of wheels down each side, the Tiger had its wheels layered, overlapping one another, interleaved so that the load of the tank was spread across many wheels at once. And it worked for its intended purpose beautifully. The ride was smooth, the weight was distributed, the gun platform was steady, and the Tiger could even shoot with good accuracy in conditions that would have thrown off a cruder machine. It is a genuinely elegant piece of engineering. And it was, at the same time, one of the worst maintenance liabilities ever built into a fighting vehicle, and the reason is the same as the reason it worked. The wheels overlapped. To distribute the load, they had to be packed together, layered over one another, and that meant that to reach a damaged inner wheel, the crew first had to remove the outer wheels stacked in front of it, sometimes many of them, to get at the one that had failed. A job that on a simple suspension would be quick became, on the Tiger, an ordeal that could take a crew the better part of a day. And it got worse, because the tight packing of all those wheels created gaps that filled with exactly what the Eastern Front had most of: mud packed into the interleaved wheels, snow packed in. And then, overnight, in the Russian winter, it froze. The mud and ice between the wheels set solid, and a Tiger that had been running perfectly the evening before could be frozen immobile by morning, its suspension locked by ice, unable to move until the crew had chipped and thawed it free. The Soviets came to understand this and learned to time attacks for dawn when the German heavy tanks might be locked in place by the night's freeze. So the same design choice delivered the best ride on the battlefield and the worst morning after on the entire front. Elegance and catastrophe from a single decision, and hold on to that suspension, because it is the thread that runs into everything that follows. And there is one more consequence of all that width and weight that the crews met before they ever reached the fighting: at the railhead. A Tiger was so wide with its full battle tracks fitted that it would not fit within the loading gauge of the European railways it had to travel on to reach the front, and tanks travel to war by rail, not on their own tracks, precisely because of the range and breakdown problems we have already met. The solution was extraordinary and tells you everything about the machine. Each Tiger was issued 2 sets of tracks. The wide combat tracks it fought on had to be removed and replaced with a set of narrower transport tracks, and the outermost road wheels taken off as well, simply to make the tank slim enough to sit on a railway wagon. On arrival, the process was reversed. The transport tracks swapped back for the battle tracks, the outer wheels refitted before the tank could fight. A machine that had to be partly disassembled and rebuilt every time it took a train is a machine whose very dimensions were at war with the logistics that had to move it. Now look at what happened when a Tiger actually needed to be repaired, because this is where the sophistication turned from a burden into something close to a curse. Every machine breaks. The question that decides whether a machine is a good fighting machine is not whether it fails, but how quickly and how far forward it can be put right, and by that measure, the Tiger was among the worst conceived vehicles of the war. Take the failure it suffered most, the transmission and final drive. The Tiger's transmission was itself a sophisticated piece of work, a semi-automatic design that made a 57-ton tank relatively easy to steer and drive by the standards of the day, another genuine engineering achievement. But it was operating at the very edge of what it could take, moving all that weight, and a driver who mishandled it, who forced a gear or turned too sharply under load, could break it, which is why driving a Tiger well took real skill. And when it did break, the trouble began. On the Tiger, replacing the transmission was not a matter of opening a hatch and lifting out a unit. Because of how the tank was built, reaching the transmission for a major repair could require removing the turret entirely, and the turret of a 57-ton tank is not something a crew lifts in the field. It required heavy lifting equipment, a workshop, rear area facilities, time. A repair that on a simpler tank might be done near the front, in hours, sent a Tiger back down the line for days or longer, out of the fight, tying up scarce recovery and workshop resources the whole way. And recovery itself was its own nightmare, because the standard way to tow a disabled tank is with another tank, and a Tiger was so heavy that a single other vehicle often could not move it. Doctrine sometimes called for multiple towing vehicles to recover one Tiger, and towing a Tiger with another Tiger risks simply breaking the second one's overstrained transmission as well, turning one casualty into two. So a Tiger that failed forward was extraordinarily hard to drag back, which meant that again and again, a machine that was mechanically disabled but completely undamaged by any shot was simply abandoned by its own crew, because it could not be moved and could not be left to be captured. And here the deeper problem surfaces, the one that made all of this fatal rather than merely inconvenient. Germany, early in the Tiger's life, made a production choice to build tanks at the expense of spare parts. The factories turned out the vehicles, but not enough of the road wheels, engines, and transmissions needed to keep them running, so a Tiger that broke apart might sit waiting for one that did not exist in the supply chain. Compare that to the machines on the other side. The medium tanks the Tiger fought, the Soviet and American designs, were built by the tens of thousands with spare parts flowing behind them, so that a broken one was quickly repaired or simply replaced. The Tiger was built to be perfect and supported, as if perfection meant it would not break. It broke, and the support was not there, and readiness rates showed it. It was not unusual for only around half of a Tiger force to be operational at a given time, while the mass-produced tanks on the other side ran at rates far higher. And this was not a rare bad week, it was the pattern from the beginning. When large numbers of German heavy and heavy-medium tanks were committed to the Great Offensive in the summer of 1943, one of the largest armored battles ever fought, a striking share of the losses and the immobilizations came not from opposing fire, but from mechanical failure, tanks breaking down as they moved up, throwing tracks, suffering engine and transmission failures on the approach march before they had fired a shot. Machines rushed into service and pushed hard revealed their unreliability at exactly the moment they were most needed, and units that were meant to arrive at full strength arrived at a fraction of it, the rest scattered along the route waiting for repair. The battlefield accounts remember the tanks that fought. The maintenance records remember the far larger number that were sidelined by their own machinery. And it is the maintenance records that tell the truer story of the whole campaign. And the detail to hold, the one that pays off in a moment, is the spare parts decision, because it turned every one of the Tiger's mechanical quirks from a delay into a defeat. Here's where the whole story comes to a point, in the arithmetic of how many were ever built. Everything we have described, the weight, the suspension, the repair nightmare, was made immeasurably worse by a single fact. There were never many Tigers. Across the entire war, something on the order of 1,350 Tiger tanks of the first type were produced. That is not a large number for a machine meant to turn battles. The medium tanks it faced were built in the tens of thousands, some designs approaching or exceeding 50,000 units. The Tiger was so complex, so labor-intensive, so demanding of skilled work and scarce materials that each one took an enormous effort to produce, and that effort could have built several simpler tanks instead. And this is the final inversion, the one that ties the whole thing together. Every quality that made the Tiger excellent as an individual machine made it scarce as an instrument of war, and a machine that is superb but rare loses to one that is merely adequate but everywhere. A tiger could defeat several of its opponents in a direct engagement and still lose the larger contest because while it was being repaired or frozen or towed or waiting for a part that never came, the other side was fielding 10 more of theirs. The right comparison was never one tiger against one opponent. It was one tiger, often broken down, against many opponents, all of them running. Walk the layers of that failure from the sophisticated down to the simple, and the pattern is the reverse of every well-designed machine. The sophisticated parts, the interleaved suspension, the powerful gun, the thick armor, were the glory. The simple things, the spare part in a depot, the tank that could be fixed near the front, the design that could be built in numbers, were what actually won. And the tiger had the glory and lacked the simple things. And at the bottom of it all, doing everything asked of them, were the crews who by many accounts handle these machines with real skill, coaxing the transmission through its gears without destroying it, nursing a temperamental giant across ground it did not want to cross, and who then, more often than any battlefield account admits, had to climb out of a perfectly intact tank and destroy it themselves because it would not move and could not be saved. Which leaves the part that no engineering could supply, and on the Tiger it is unusually stark. Everything we have described, the armor, the engine, the suspension, the gun, did exactly what it was designed to do and, in the narrow moment of contact, did it better than almost anything else on the battlefield. None of it could decide whether it was in the right place, whether it could get home, whether there would be a part to fix it. The machine was built to win an engagement and was indifferent to everything around the engagement, and that indifference had to be made up by people. The crews carried an extraordinary load. They needed far more training than the men in simpler tanks because a Tiger's transmission could be destroyed by a driver who shifted it wrongly, so driving one well was a skilled art in itself. They spent far more time on maintenance because the machine demanded it constantly. The suspension needing attention, the wheels needing clearing, the whole vehicle needing the kind of care that a simpler tank did not. A Tiger crew were as much mechanics as fighters, and the hours they poured into keeping their machine alive were hours the crews of simpler tanks did not have to spend. A hidden tax that the specification sheet never showed, and that fell entirely on the people, and they bore the psychological weight of operating a machine that was magnificent when it ran and helpless when it did not, knowing that a night's frost or a snapped final drive could turn their invincible tank into a stranded object they would have to abandon. The honest pattern, the one the whole history shows, is that the Tiger was not defeated so much by any opponent as by the accumulated weight of its own excellence, the breakdowns and the freezing and the towing and the missing spares and the sheer scarcity, and that the thing standing between the design's ambitions and total futility was, again and again, the skill and endurance of a crew asked to do the impossible with a machine that gave them no margin. The specification sheet does not conclude. It only lists what the machine can do in the perfect moment. Everything outside that moment was left to people, and there were never enough people or parts or tanks to carry a design that had spent all its genius on being superb and none of it on being enough. So count the 4 again, quickly, the way they actually stack. The weight that made it nearly impervious also strained every moving part and sank it in soft ground. The interleaved suspension that gave it a steady, accurate gun also froze solid and turned a wheel change into a day's ordeal. The sophistication that made it magnificent also made it a nightmare to repair and recover, so that intact tanks were abandoned for want of a tow or a part. And the complexity that made each one superb meant there were never enough of them to matter. 4 qualities, each a strength and its own defeat, and the 5th thing we named at the start now has a face. It is the crew climbing out to destroy a tank that no shot ever touched. Go back to the image we opened with, the most feared machine on the battlefield, and you can see it differently now. The Tiger was not a bad design. As an object, in the moment it was built for, it was brilliant. And that is exactly the trap. It was engineered to win the second of contact and to ignore the hours and days and miles and factories that surround that second. And war is made of the hours and the miles and the factories far more than the second. The Tiger is the permanent lesson that the best machine and the best fighting instrument are not the same thing. That a design which spends everything on superiority and nothing on reliability, repairability, and numbers has built a magnificent way to lose. The specification was never the war. The war was everything the specification left out. If you want to keep going inside machines like this one, the ones almost no one is allowed near, that is the whole reason this channel exists, so subscribe and stay with it. The next one turns to the machine on the other side of the story, the mass-produced medium tank that was mechanically unremarkable, outgunned and out-armored in every direct comparison, and yet was arguably the better machine of war, and asks the uncomfortable question of what better even means once you count the whole war, and not just the duel. And a question for the comments while you sit with this one. If a machine is superior in every direct contest and still loses the war around it, was it a great design that was badly used? Or a bad design that looked great on paper, and are those really different things? There is a real argument on both sides, and I would like to read yours. This video is for educational purposes only. It draws unpublished engineering literature, declassified documentation, manufacturer and service publications, and investigated peacetime incident reports. Where a figure is an outside estimate or has never been released, this is stated, and where practice varies between services or jurisdictions, this is noted. Nothing in this video is operational guidance.